The sound of the machines in Lily's hospital room had become part of me, a cruel, mechanical heartbeat that reminded me my little girl was still here, but only barely. Every beep felt like a countdown, marking time I didn't want to measure. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and latex gloves, the kind of sterile cleanliness that tries to disguise the scent of decay and hopelessness. The curtains were drawn halfway, letting in the gray morning light that painted everything in pale blue tones. I sat in the same chair I had been sitting in for weeks, the cushion molded to the shape of my exhaustion. My body ached, my clothes clung to me, wrinkled and lifeless, much like the woman I had become since we were told what was coming. Lily was lying in the bed beside me, her small frame almost disappearing into the white sheets. Her skin had gone so pale it was almost translucent, and I could see the faint blue of her veins under the surface. Her hair, once thick and golden, had thinned out to soft wisps that stuck to her forehead when she sweated through the night. Her lips were dry, but she still smiled when she saw me, and that smile, God, that smile, was the only thing keeping me from collapsing. Her voice was a whisper now, light and airy, as if even speaking was too much work for her little lungs. "Mommy," she said that morning, her hand weakly reaching for mine. Her fingers were so small, so fragile, they could barely curl around my thumb. "Mommy, can we go to the park when I feel better?" I swallowed hard, the words catching in my throat. I didn't answer immediately, because what do you say to your dying child when she still believes in better tomorrows? I felt the familiar sting behind my eyes, but I didn't cry. I had learned not to cry in front of her. Tears made her sad, and I refused to let sadness take away the small moments of joy we had left. "Of course, sweetheart," I said finally, my voice breaking just a little. "We'll go to the park, and you can feed the ducks, and we'll get ice cream afterward." Her face lit up for a brief second, and she nodded, satisfied, before drifting back into that half-sleep where her eyelids fluttered but she wasn't fully gone yet. The doctors had already told me the truth days ago. There would be no park. No ducks. No ice cream. Just more pain, and then the quiet that comes when the machines finally stop beeping. Stage 4 neuroblastoma. I had repeated the words so many times that they had lost meaning, like a chant that no longer summoned emotion. The oncologist, Dr. Hayes, had tried to sound gentle when she told me, but there's no gentle way to tell a mother that her child's body is losing its fight. "We're doing everything we can," she had said. "But at this stage, it's about keeping her comfortable." Comfort. As if comfort could fix the fact that I was going to outlive my daughter. I remembered the day of the diagnosis so clearly it still burned in my mind. Lily had been having stomach pains for weeks, and I kept thinking it was something simple, an allergy, a virus, maybe something she ate. The pediatrician sent us for scans, and I held her hand as she giggled at the sound of the MRI machine, completely unaware of what was coming. When the results came in, the doctor couldn't look me in the eye. He said the words malignant and metastasized, and I felt the ground fall away. I remember clutching Lily's little pink jacket in my lap as I sat in that office, unable to breathe, unable to process what any of it meant. All I could think about was how she had been playing with her dolls that morning, asking if her stuffed rabbit could come to preschool with her. Now we lived here, in this room, where day and night blended together. Nurses came and went, their faces kind but distant. They whispered in the hallway sometimes, thinking I couldn't hear, talking about her vitals, about her decline. One of them, a young nurse named Carla, always tried to make small talk with me when she came in to check Lily's for. "She's such a fighter," she would say, smiling softly. I would nod, because that was what people expected me to do. But inside, I was hollow. Every night I sat by Lily's bed and listened to her breathing, terrified of the moment when it would stop. I barely slept. I barely ate. My whole world had shrunk to this sterile room and the fragile heartbeat of a child who shouldn't have had to fight so hard just to exist. Sometimes, in the rare quiet moments, I found myself staring at the window. The hospital was on the 6th floor, and from here, I could see the city lights at night. Cars moved like tiny stars, people living lives that didn't know mine was falling apart. I used to imagine Lily running through a park somewhere beyond those lights, her hair catching the sun, her laughter echoing through the trees. I tried to hold on to that image because it was the only one that didn't end with her fading away. When night fell, the machines became louder somehow, their rhythmic beeping filling every inch of the room. I would adjust her blanket, brush the hair from her forehead, and whisper stories into her ear, stories about the ocean, about flying, about the park she wanted to go to. Sometimes she'd smile faintly, her lips curving just enough to remind me that she could still hear me, that she was still here. Those were the moments I lived for. But beneath it all, there was a heavy silence, the kind that pressed down on my chest and made it hard to breathe. The kind that told me I was running out of time. I kept talking to her anyway, even when she was asleep, even when I knew she couldn't answer. I told her about the weather outside, about how her favorite nurse had brought her a new stuffed bear, about how proud I was of her. I told her I loved her 100 times a day, sometimes whispering it so quietly it was only for me to hear. Because when the machines finally stopped, I needed to know that the last thing she heard in this world was my voice saying those words. My phone buzzed on the metal side table next to Lily's bed, the vibration sharp and jarring against the soft hum of the hospital room. I didn't check it right away. My hand was still holding Lily's, and even though her grip was barely there, just the weight of her fingers on mine was enough to anchor me. Eventually, when her breathing evened out again and her eyes fluttered closed, I reached for it with slow reluctance, already dreading whatever would be waiting for me on the screen. 17 unread messages. All from Rebecca. I opened the thread and scrolled upward, each line more oblivious than the last. You have to come to my housewarming. It's gonna be amazing. I've been planning this for months, you can't bail on me. Mom and Dad are even flying in. Then came the photos, her new place, some overpriced 2-bedroom apartment downtown with granite countertops and an unnecessary wine fridge. She posed next to the island with her fiancé, Jordan, holding a bottle of champagne like it was a trophy. There were fairy lights strung across the ceiling and an expensive floral arrangement on the dining table, as if this aesthetic achievement somehow earned her extra importance. Her final message hit like a slap across the face, "Please don't make this about you. I need you to be there for me, Emily." I stared at the words, reading them again and again, feeling the burn in the back of my throat intensify. The date she had proudly included in bold caps, June 12th, was only days away. The same week the doctors had told me Lily wouldn't make it past. Maybe not even that far. Rebecca knew. She had known since January, when I called her sobbing from the emergency room as the doctors explained the results of the latest scans. She knew about the failed treatments, the clinical trials that didn't work, the sleepless nights I spent in this very chair watching my daughter slowly disappear. She knew everything, and yet here she was, begging me to show up for hors d'oeuvres and a goddamn cheese board. I tightened my grip on the phone and then immediately loosened it, afraid the motion might wake Lily. She stirred slightly, one hand twitching as she turned her head toward me in her sleep. Her lips parted just enough to release a breath that sounded like a sigh, too soft to be called a sound. I couldn't believe Rebecca had the nerve to say I was making this about me, as if choosing not to abandon my dying child for her ego-fueled party was some kind of personal slight. The privilege of her ignorance boiled my blood. She had never once come to the hospital. Not once. She sent texts occasionally, usually something vague and performative like "thinking of you guys" or "sending love," but she never stepped foot into this room. She never saw Lily with the 4 lines taped to her arms, never heard her crying out in pain during the night when the morphine wore off too soon, never sat with me while I tried to spoon-feed her ice chips when her throat was too raw for water. But now, suddenly, she wanted family unity. She wanted a guest list that included our parents, who were flying in for the occasion as if their presence was some grand offering. I wondered if they even planned to stop by the hospital at all before heading to Rebecca's new place to drink wine and tour the guest bathroom. Mom had called a few times in the past month, her voice always tight and fragile, but she never stayed on the phone for long. Dad barely spoke. I knew they didn't know what to say. I didn't blame them for that. There's no manual for watching your granddaughter fade away. But Rebecca? She had the audacity to guilt-trip me while I sat next to Lily's hospital bed, listening to the machines that were the only thing still keeping her body from shutting down completely. I looked at the last message again and reread it until my vision blurred. "Please don't make this about you." I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the phone across the room and watch it shatter, to hear something break that wasn't me for once. I wanted to tell her how it felt to hold your child while they screamed in pain and there was nothing you could do. I wanted her to understand that I hadn't been a person for months. I was a ghost orbiting Lily's bed, a caretaker running on caffeine and adrenaline, living in a cycle of fear and helplessness. There was no me left to make anything about. I had given every last piece of myself to my daughter, and I would keep giving until the very end. Lily stirred again and opened her eyes, glassy and rimmed with red. She looked at me with that same quiet trust she always did, the kind that cut through every layer of my soul. "Are we going home soon, Mommy?" she asked, her voice hoarse and barely audible. I blinked hard to force back the tears and leaned in, brushing her cheek with the back of my hand. "Not today, sweetheart," I whispered. "But I'm right here, okay? I'm not going anywhere." My phone buzzed again in my lap, but I didn't look this time. There was nothing Rebecca could say that mattered anymore. That night, after sitting for hours beside Lily's hospital bed while the machines continued their steady, soulless chorus in the background, I stood up with stiff legs, walked slowly out into the dim hallway just past the nurse's station, and made the call I'd been dreading but unable to avoid. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through my contacts, my thumb hovering for a second over Rebecca's name, the screen glowing against the dark like a warning light I ignored. I tapped it, raised the phone to my ear, and listened to the ring with my heart hammering in my chest, each beat a mixture of fury, grief, and exhaustion so profound I felt like I could sink straight through the floor. She answered quickly, her voice bright and breathy, as if she'd been expecting something entirely different. Finally. I was just thinking about you. I wanted to ask, did you see the invite design I sent? Jordan's friend said it looked a little too minimalist, but I think. I didn't even let her finish the sentence before I cut in, my voice tight, brittle, the words trembling but sharp enough to hurt. My daughter is dying, I said, forcing each syllable through the lump in my throat. And you're talking to me about party favors? There was a pause, brief but loaded, followed by the sound of her sighing like I'd just made things unnecessarily complicated. Then came the words that split me open. Emily, life goes on. You can't make everyone pause for your tragedy. Her voice was calm. Not cruel, not angry, just matter of fact, like she was delivering a neutral truth I should have already accepted. Like my child's death was an unfortunate detail, but ultimately irrelevant to the bigger picture of her life moving forward. I felt the air drain out of my lungs in one sickening swoop, and before I could say anything else, before I screamed, or cried, or begged her to understand, I pressed the red button and ended the call. I stood there in the hallway with the phone still clutched in my hand, my knuckles white around it, my body trembling, not from cold, but from the weight of everything I had just heard and everything I already knew. Rebecca's voice rang in my ears long after the call ended, that single phrase, your tragedy, looping like a cruel mantra. My tragedy. As if Lily was an accident I needed to get over. As if I had any room left in my body for anything but her, as if grief wasn't already blooming inside me like something alive, something monstrous and devouring. When I walked back into the room, the light above Lily's bed was dimmed, casting soft shadows across her face, and she was sleeping again, her chest rising and falling with that fragile rhythm that never let me forget how close the end was. I sank back into the chair beside her, placed the phone face down on the table, and took her hand in mine, trying to push Rebecca's words out of my mind and replace them with the only thing that mattered, the warmth still left in my daughter's skin. The days that followed were slow and merciless. Lily barely spoke anymore. Her eyes were open less often, and when they were, they seemed to look through me, like she was already halfway to wherever she was going. I held her as much as I could, told her stories, whispered memories she was too young to hold on to, hoping that maybe, just maybe, they'd stay with her even after she slipped beyond the edge of this world. The nurses moved around us with a tenderness that made me ache, their voices low, their footsteps quieter than ever. June 8th came like any other day, gray, damp, indifferent. I woke up in the chair with my neck stiff, Lily still beside me, her breath shallow and infrequent. The doctor had said it would be soon, and I knew this was it. I climbed gently into the bed beside her, cradling her like I used to when she was a baby, my arms wrapped around her little frame, so light now it felt like holding air. Her head rested beneath my chin, and I could feel every labored breath echo through her ribs. I whispered to her again and again, stories about the park and the ducks and the ice cream she'd asked for, my voice steady even as the tears fell down my cheeks and soaked into her hair. I told her how proud I was of her, how strong she had been, how much I loved her. I said it over and over, hoping it would reach her wherever she was drifting. Then, just as the sun started to rise behind the hospital window, her tiny voice, raspy and weak but unmistakable, broke through the silence one final time. I love you, Mommy, she said, barely audible. And then she was gone. There was no sound but the absence of sound, no breath, no heartbeat, only stillness. I held her tighter, rocking her gently, my tears silent now, endless, as the light from the window stretched across the sheets and the machines behind us finally went still. When the funeral director told me the only available date was June 12th, I remember staring at him in silence, my brain refusing to connect the numbers to the meaning behind them. June 12th. The words echoed in my head like static. I already knew what that date was. It was the day Rebecca had been bragging about for weeks, the day of her precious housewarming party. The one she'd insisted would bring everyone together. I thought, naively, that this would make things simple. That for once, the universe would make the choice clear. I assumed my family would call her, would tell her to reschedule. Surely no one could celebrate on the same day we were burying a child. Surely, they would come to say goodbye to their granddaughter, to their niece. I was wrong. When I told my parents, my voice cracked halfway through the sentence. The funeral home said the 12th is the only date they have open. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint hum of the television in the background, my mother's sharp inhale, my father's distant sigh. Then, after a silence that felt endless, my mother said softly, "We'll figure something out." Her tone was careful, practiced, the kind of voice she used when she didn't want to deal with something but still wanted to sound kind. Figure something out should have been a comfort, but it landed like a weight in my chest. Because I knew what it really meant. It meant they wouldn't choose. They never did. In the days leading up to the funeral, no one called to confirm travel plans. No one asked about details. My parents texted once, something short, something meaningless, "We're thinking of you." Rebecca didn't say a word. The silence between us had turned into something solid and immovable, a wall I didn't have the strength to climb. I spent those days alone in my small apartment, surrounded by the remnants of Lily's life, her pink blanket folded at the end of the bed, her favorite stuffed bear sitting upright on the couch, the tiny shoes she'd only worn twice before the hospital stays made walking impossible. I could still smell her shampoo on the pillowcase. Every object in the room felt alive with her absence. The morning of June 12th was clear, unbearably beautiful. The sky was the same pale blue Lily had loved, the kind of sky she would have pointed at and said, "Look, Mommy, it's happy." I remember hating that sky. I wanted it to rain. I wanted thunder. I wanted the world to look like it understood what was happening. Instead, sunlight spilled through the windows as if the universe was mocking me. The funeral home was small and quiet, the kind of place where the air feels too still, too careful, like even breathing too loudly would be inappropriate. The room was filled with the smell of lilies, white lilies, of course, and the faint tang of candle wax. The coffin was so small it didn't seem real, pristine white with a satin lining that looked too perfect for something so devastating. I stood there in front of it, numb. My hands shook as I placed a single pink rose on top of the coffin, the same color as the one Lily used to pick from the garden behind our old house. There were a few people scattered among the pews, nurses from the hospital, a neighbor, Lily's preschool teacher who kept her head bowed the entire time. But my family's seats were empty. Every time the door opened, I turned, expecting them. Hoping, even after everything, that maybe they had come. They didn't. When the service began, I listened to the pastor speak words I couldn't hear. His voice was gentle and low, talking about peace, about heaven, about how Lily's spirit was now free from pain. I wanted to believe him, but all I could think about was her little hand going cold in mine. The image looped behind my eyes over and over until the room blurred. I didn't cry during the ceremony. I'd cried everything out of myself in the hospital. What was left of me was hollow, mechanical. I just stood there, staring at the white coffin that held the only person who had ever needed me completely. My chest ached so violently it almost felt like my ribs were cracking open from the inside. After the burial, I stayed behind when everyone else left. The cemetery was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels alive. I knelt beside the fresh mound of earth, tracing Lily's name on the headstone with trembling fingers. I whispered things I didn't even understand, apologies, memories, fragments of thoughts that didn't form sentences. The wind was soft, warm, gentle against my skin, and for a fleeting moment I imagined it was her, brushing past me, telling me she was okay. I stayed there until the groundskeeper came by and hesitated politely at a distance, waiting for me to move. When I finally looked at my phone, there were 2 messages waiting. One from my mother, one from Rebecca. My mother's text read, "We're so sorry we couldn't make it, sweetie. The flights were complicated. We'll visit next week." I read it twice before I opened the next one. Rebecca had sent a photo. Her smiling beside the pool, champagne glass raised high, sunlight glinting off the water behind her. "Wish you could have come," she wrote underneath, followed by a string of heart emojis and the words, "Lily would have wanted everyone to be happy." I remember standing there, in that cemetery, staring at that screen, feeling something inside me fracture beyond repair. The laughter in that photo, their joy, their celebration, felt obscene against the silence around me. I turned off my phone and dropped it into my bag without responding. The sound of the wind through the trees was the only thing left, and I realized, standing over that tiny white coffin, that I was truly, utterly alone. That night, after the funeral, after the cemetery had emptied and the sky had gone dark and silent, I went home to an apartment that didn't feel like mine anymore. The air inside was too still, too thick, like even the walls were grieving, and everywhere I turned I saw pieces of her, the crayon drawing still taped to the fridge, the little pink socks she'd kicked off one afternoon and I never picked up, the toothbrush still standing in its holder next to mine. I didn't turn on the lights. I moved through the rooms by memory, the dark familiar, almost comforting, because at least in the dark, I didn't have to see how hollow everything had become. I sat on the floor of Lily's room, my back pressed against her bed frame, knees drawn up to my chest, and I finally unlocked my phone. I don't even know why I did it. Habit, maybe. A compulsion. Something inside me needed to see if the world had paused, if it had even noticed what had been lost. My fingers moved on autopilot, and within seconds, I was staring at the app that had always been Rebecca's favorite stage. The first thing that appeared on my screen was a photo. Rebecca, standing in the center of what looked like her new backyard, smiling so wide her teeth looked sharpened by joy, dressed in a perfectly pressed white summer dress, her blonde hair curled just enough to look effortless. Her arm was hooked through Jordan's, who held a bottle of wine aloft like a prize, and behind them stood clusters of smiling guests with cocktails and manicured hands, all lit by the golden haze of string lights and the kind of party that requires weeks of planning and zero grief. The caption beneath it was so tone-deaf it felt like a slap across my face. Surrounded by love and family. Grateful for new beginnings. There was a white heart emoji. A champagne bottle. A clinking glass. I read it once. Then again. And then again, slower, as if maybe there was something I was missing. Something that would make it sting less. But no, every word was deliberate. Every word was chosen. I scrolled down to the comments. My mother had written, "So proud of you, sweetie," with a red heart and 3 exclamation marks. Just 6 hours after I had buried Lily. Just 6 hours after they had told me they couldn't make it because of flights, because of timing, because of complications. Just 6 hours after I stood alone over my child's coffin, whispering goodbye to the only person who ever loved me without condition, they had raised glasses in celebration of granite countertops and new curtains. I stared at that screen until my eyes blurred. My fingers were clenched around the phone so tightly it hurt, but I didn't feel it. I couldn't feel anything. Something inside me that had already been cracking for months, under the weight of appointments, and morphine drips, and sleepless nights listening to Lily's labored breathing, finally shattered. But it wasn't grief that consumed me in that moment. It wasn't even sadness. It was something colder. Something sharper. I felt it settle in my chest like a stone dropped into still water. Something inside me froze solid. The word love didn't mean anything anymore. Not after what they had done. Not after they chose celebration over mourning. Not after they smiled for photos while I crumbled into the soil beside my child. The word family was as hollow as the promises they made. They weren't my family anymore. They were people I used to share a name with, people whose approval I had once tried to earn, but now I saw them for what they were, performers, shallow and self-absorbed, incapable of empathy, incapable of standing still for someone else's pain unless it made for a good story or a convenient Instagram post. But what I did feel, what surged up like fire through the numbness, was something I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge in months. It didn't tremble. It didn't cry. It burned. Revenge. It was the only thing still alive in me. It didn't matter that they smiled and pretended everything was beautiful. It didn't matter that they'd plastered their public faces over the day my world ended. Because I would remember. I would carry this moment with me, the same way I carried Lily's last breath in my arms. And I would make sure they never forgot what they did. Grief is supposed to make people collapse, slow them down, bury them under the weight of absence, but for me, after Lily's funeral, it did the opposite, it sharpened me. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I barely moved from my apartment, but my mind was blisteringly clear. My body ran on something different now, something lean and cold and focused. And it all pointed in one direction, Rebecca. I couldn't stop seeing her face in that photo, her mouth open mid-laugh, surrounded by champagne glasses and praise, while my daughter's body was still cooling in the ground. She had taken everything from me, my parents, my dignity, and the last shreds of familial love I had left. So I stopped crying. I stopped waiting for apologies that weren't coming. And I started digging. At first, it was aimless, scrolling through her LinkedIn page at 2 in the morning, scanning her smug bullet points and exaggerated titles. Top regional performer, Q2 and Q3. Executive consultant for clinical accounts. The kind of phrasing that sounds important but says nothing. She worked for a mid-sized pharmaceutical company that manufactured cancer treatment drugs and specialized medications for chronic pain management, drugs I was all too familiar with. As a registered nurse, I'd administered those exact medications. I'd seen the protocols. I knew how the system worked, or more importantly, how it could be manipulated. The more I read, the more the threads began to unravel. Her numbers didn't make sense. For someone relatively new to the industry, her territory results were not just good, they were suspiciously perfect. Her region, a small cluster of hospitals and clinics in 3 zip codes, was reporting prescription numbers higher than areas twice its size. That's when I remembered a conversation from months ago, Rebecca bragging at dinner, back before Lily got sick, about how she had clients who couldn't say no, and how some sweeteners went a long way. Back then I'd assumed she was just being her usual self, obnoxious, smug, desperate to sound important. But now, every word felt like a breadcrumb. I pulled out my old hospital laptop. I still had remote access to internal communication logs and vendor reports from my last position before Lily's diagnosis forced me to take leave. I cross-checked Rebecca's name against our vendor contact lists. She wasn't listed anywhere officially, but her company? Everywhere. And more than that, several of the doctors on our consulting panels had received what were labeled as honorarium payments during the months when her company was pushing a specific anti-nausea drug, one that had recently come under FDA scrutiny for off-label promotions. I flagged them all. Then I went deeper. I checked regional sales reports that were available through our procurement records and noticed the same pattern: massive spikes in orders from clinics that had never previously ordered in bulk, almost all tied to the exact time frame when Rebecca had been reassigned to the territory. I remembered names: Dr. Kessler, an oncologist who had always been oddly defensive during staff meetings; Dr. Morrow, who once refused to switch a patient to a more affordable generic despite my suggestion. Both had appeared in her social media posts, smiling beside her at networking events, tagged with nauseating captions like "always grateful for passionate partners in care." I started pulling their prescribing histories from public Medicare databases and saw the truth laid bare: they were all funneling patients through her products at a rate that was not only unethical, it was illegal. There were consulting fees, sure, but when I looked at the payment structures, I saw what they really were: bribes disguised as educational grants, incentives for pushing overpriced medication regardless of efficacy. Some payments were routed through shell LLCs, many of which were registered just weeks before the consultations took place. It wasn't even clever. It was just greedy. The texts came next. Rebecca wasn't careful, not even remotely. I still had a backup from our old family group chat, and in it were a few stray screenshots she had shared, bragging about hitting sales goals and joking that she owed Dr. K a steak dinner. In one, she even joked about giving someone's receptionist a spa gift card to keep the samples moving. I took a screenshot of everything. Every laugh emoji, every dollar amount, every wink. Emails, too, leaked through forwarded chains from former coworkers who were too busy or indifferent to scrub the metadata. Subject lines like urgent, Q4 targets, and follow-up on speaker series payments. I traced them all, building a quiet web of damning evidence. The money was there. The motive was clear. The manipulation was precise. But what hit me hardest wasn't the corruption. It was the realization that she had used my world, hospitals, patients, suffering, as her personal chessboard. She was trafficking in pain, profiting off desperation, packaging it as success. It made sense, in a sickening way. While Lily was dying, choking on the side effects of meds that barely touched the pain, my sister was pushing those same drugs with a grin and a sales pitch. I thought back to the long nights I'd spent holding Lily as she writhed in bed, her body rejecting treatment after treatment, while Rebecca sent out newsletters about how passionate she was about improving patient outcomes. It wasn't just hypocrisy. It was blood money. And I was done pretending we shared anything but DNA. I saved every file, every screenshot, every database entry. I created backups, encrypted drives, printed hard copies. This wasn't just a trail, it was a case. And as I sat there in the dark, surrounded by folders of evidence and the silence of a home too quiet without Lily, I knew with absolute clarity that I wasn't going to stop. Not until everyone saw what she was. Not until the world knew who they toasted champagne with while I buried my daughter. Z. When I finally decided to go public, it wasn't a burst of rage or some dramatic moment of clarity. It was quiet. Cold. Methodical. The same kind of quiet that comes right before a storm when the air feels too still, too heavy. I had spent weeks compiling everything: emails, transaction logs, spreadsheets, internal correspondence, the works. I had enough evidence to make even the most seasoned compliance officer choke on their coffee. But I didn't want to hand it off anonymously. I wanted to look someone in the eye and make them understand exactly who Rebecca was, what she had done, and why this wasn't just a story about corporate corruption. It was a story about a woman who smiled through the funeral of her niece while cashing checks built on other people's suffering. The journalist's name was Daniel Moore. He wrote for a major investigative outlet that specialized in healthcare and corporate ethics exposés. I'd followed his work for years and trusted him because he wasn't the kind of reporter who chased gossip or viral outrage. He cared about proof, about impact. I reached out to him using a throwaway email, attaching redacted versions of a few key documents, enough to catch his attention, but not enough to expose myself prematurely. He responded within a day, asking to meet in person. His tone was careful, professional, skeptical but curious. I could tell from the phrasing of his email that he already sensed there was more to the story than what I had sent him. We met in a small cafe near the river, the kind of place where no one really listens to anyone else. I sat in a corner booth with a folder thick enough to choke a shredder and waited. When he arrived, he looked exactly like someone who had seen too much of the world's rot, tired eyes, notepad in his breast pocket, the faint smell of burnt coffee on his coat. We exchanged polite greetings, but once I laid the folder on the table and slid it across to him, the tone shifted completely. He opened it, started skimming, and after a few minutes, his jaw tightened. He looked up at me, his expression unreadable, and asked, "This is your sister?" I nodded once. My throat felt tight, but I managed to say, "She's been doing this for years." He didn't respond immediately. He kept flipping through the papers, emails confirming payments to doctors under false pretenses, spreadsheets showing inflated sales numbers, documentation from the hospital procurement logs I'd pulled through my credentials. I could see the gears turning behind his eyes, the quiet calculation of someone who knew exactly how deep this went. Finally, he exhaled slowly and said, "If even half of this checks out, this isn't just a company scandal. It's federal." Over the next 2 weeks, we worked in secret. He fact-checked every lead I gave him, cross-referenced sources, called hospitals and physicians listed in the documentation, and even got a whistleblower statement from one of Rebecca's former co-workers who confirmed that consulting bonuses were just coded kickbacks. He told me he was sitting on one of the biggest stories of his career. I told him I didn't care about careers, I wanted the truth out. I wanted her stripped bare, her polished reputation burned down to ash. The night the article went live, I was sitting in Lily's room again, surrounded by her toys and drawings. The title appeared on my phone like a pulse of light in the dark, "Top Pharma Rep Accused of Fraud and Patient Endangerment." My breath caught. I clicked. There it was, her name in bold print, her photo, her company's logo beside it, and paragraph after paragraph outlining every sordid detail. The reporter had done his work thoroughly. He had the timeline, the payment trails, the fake consulting contracts, the falsified prescription data. It was airtight. Within hours, it spread like wildfire. The story hit national news sites before noon, and by evening, it was trending on Twitter. There were screenshots, quotes, outrage, and disbelief. People dug through her old posts, dragging up every fake motivational caption she'd ever written, every photo of her at conferences where she had spoken about integrity in patient care. Her company released a statement that afternoon saying she had been terminated effective immediately pending investigation. By sunset, federal prosecutors had announced that they were opening a formal inquiry into fraudulent marketing practices and kickbacks tied to her accounts. It was everything she had built her identity around, her job, her image, her success, turning into rubble in real time. Someone uploaded a video of news vans parked outside her pristine suburban house. The same driveway where she had posed with champagne glasses just weeks earlier now looked like a crime scene, reporters shouting questions she refused to answer, neighbors peeking through curtains, cameras flashing through the blinds. I watched it all from my couch, my laptop screen casting a blue glow across the darkened room. Her perfect little world was collapsing, and I didn't feel guilt. Not even a flicker of it. Because as far as I was concerned, this wasn't vengeance, it was justice. Justice for every patient manipulated by greed, for every family bankrupted by inflated drug costs, for every mother who held a child in pain because people like Rebecca saw illness as opportunity. But most of all, it was justice for Lily. Rebecca's career disintegrated almost immediately, like paper catching flame. One day she was the bright face of her company, a smiling, well-dressed woman who spoke at conferences about ethics in healthcare, and the next, she was a name whispered in disgust, a face blurred out in corporate training slides about compliance violations. The company severed ties within 24 hours of the article going live, calling her behavior a violation of professional standards, though everyone knew it wasn't just her. They were scrambling to distance themselves before the investigators widened their scope. Her phone was seized, her bank accounts frozen pending review, and her email inbox was turned over to the legal team that would later hand it to federal prosecutors. She didn't even have time to control the narrative, the internet had already decided who she was. My parents, of course, rallied around her. That's what they did, they'd always protected her from the consequences she earned. When she got caught stealing from my mother's purse as a teenager, they blamed her friends. When she lied about failing her first semester in college, they blamed the professors. And now, when she stood accused of fraud, bribery, and endangering patients, they blamed the media. "It's a smear campaign," my mother said on a voicemail she left me that week, her voice trembling with panic. "You know how jealous people can be of success. We just need to stay strong as a family." She didn't realize that word had already died for me. Family. They drained their savings almost overnight to pay for Rebecca's lawyers, high-profile, expensive, self-assured men in dark suits who charged more per hour than I had ever made in a month as a nurse. They mortgaged part of their house to cover the retainer. I knew all of this not because they told me, but because the details slipped out in the coverage. Reporters had started digging into the family's finances once Rebecca's name became synonymous with scandal. I didn't feel satisfaction at first, only a kind of numb inevitability, like watching gravity do its work. But the more I read, the more I saw them scrambling to protect her image, the more the cold inside me hardened. Because for all their denial, all their excuses, they hadn't just supported her, they'd celebrated her. They had lifted their glasses by the pool, laughing and posing for photos at the exact same hour I stood in a funeral home over Lily's coffin. That wasn't something I could forgive, and it wasn't something I was willing to let the world ignore anymore. I still had those photos saved, the ones Rebecca had posted to social media before she took her accounts private, the ones her friends had tagged her in, smiling, their faces bright in the golden light of the party. The metadata was still embedded, the timestamps precise down to the minute. June 12, 1:47 p.m. That was when she'd raised her champagne glass. June 12, 1:47 p.m. That was when the minister had been lowering Lily's coffin into the ground. The two images, side by side in my mind, became unbearable. So I decided they wouldn't stay in my mind anymore. I compiled them, screenshots, captions, timestamps, and sent them to the same journalist who had broken the original story. No commentary, no explanation. Just the truth. The photos spoke louder than any statement ever could. He verified the timestamps, cross-referenced the obituary, and within 48 hours, the second wave hit the internet like a tidal surge. The headline appeared at dawn, brutal in its simplicity: "Family celebrates while child's funeral takes place." The subheading spelled out the connection in black and white: Rebecca, recently terminated pharmaceutical executive under federal investigation, hosted a poolside party the same day her niece was laid to rest. The article didn't embellish. It didn't need to. The photos did the talking: Rebecca laughing, my mother's arm around her waist, my father raising a glass in the background, the pool reflecting the sun like nothing in the world had gone wrong. And next to it, the funeral program for a 3-year-old girl named Lily, timestamped just an hour earlier. Public outrage was instant and merciless. Comment sections filled with disgust. News anchors used phrases like moral rot and unimaginable callousness. Hashtags spread within hours, hashtag justice for Lily, hashtag family of shame. The party photos went viral, circulating across every platform. People dissected the image of my parents and sister frame by frame, strangers parsing their smiles like evidence in a trial. Sponsors cut ties with Rebecca's company, her former colleagues deleted their LinkedIn endorsements, and one of the doctors implicated in the fraud scandal publicly denounced her to save his own reputation. My parents didn't escape untouched. Reporters found their names easily, their comments beneath Rebecca's post, and plastered them alongside the story. "So proud of you, sweetie," my mother had written. "Surrounded by love and family." That line became a national symbol of hypocrisy, a soundbite repeated on morning news shows, a tagline beneath her photo as cameras filmed outside their house. They tried to issue a statement claiming they weren't aware of the timing, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. The world had seen. Rebecca's indictment came 3 days later. Federal prosecutors filed formal charges: fraud, conspiracy, falsification of medical records. The press captured footage of her leaving her house flanked by lawyers, head down, sunglasses on, her face pale and tight. The perfect house in the perfect suburb was now ringed with news vans and protesters holding signs about greed and justice. My parents stayed inside, blinds drawn, but I saw the images online: my mother's car in the driveway, my father's hand covering his face as they tried to push past cameras. I watched it unfold in silence from my couch. The television cast a soft glow across the room, and for the first time in months, I felt the smallest flicker of something like stillness. Not happiness. Not peace. Just stillness, the kind that comes when there is nothing left to hide, nothing left to explain. The world finally saw them as I did. And for me, that was enough. It was late afternoon when I heard the banging at my door, sharp, uneven, frantic. For a moment, I didn't move. I sat on the couch with my tea gone cold in my hands, staring at the sound as if it were a hallucination, a ghost rattling the frame. Then came the voice, shrill, broken, unmistakably hers. "Emily! Open the door. Please." I stood slowly, every movement deliberate, setting the cup down on the coffee table with the kind of careful precision you learn in grief. I already knew who it was. I already knew why she was here. I opened the door without ceremony. Rebecca stood there, mascara streaked down her cheeks in black rivulets, hair a frizzy, tangled mess, her designer coat slipping off one shoulder, arms shaking as she clutched a phone in one hand and a crumpled tissue in the other. Her face, usually so composed, so camera-ready, was bloated and red, twisted into something almost unrecognizable. She looked like someone who had finally realized the consequences weren't theoretical anymore. Her eyes locked onto mine like I owed her something. "You destroyed me," she shrieked, voice cracking. "You ruined my life. Over one mistake." I didn't speak. I didn't move. I just looked at her, standing on my front step, trembling not from remorse but from exposure. She wasn't here to apologize. She was here because she'd lost control of the story. She was here because the world had finally stopped applauding. She took a step closer, eyes wild, desperate. "Do you know what they're saying about me?" she shouted, her voice raw and brittle. "They've turned me into a villain. I can't go outside without cameras in my face. I've lost everything, my job, my reputation, my future, and for what? Because I made one mistake? One." I blinked slowly, the weight of her words settling in the space between us like ash. I thought of Lily's face, peaceful in death, and the coffin so small it barely seemed real. I thought of standing alone in the funeral home while Rebecca sipped champagne by a pool and called it grateful for new beginnings. My voice, when I finally spoke, was quiet, too quiet for the storm she'd expected. "You called my daughter's funeral a minor event," I said, each word measured, the edge beneath them sharpened by months of silent, suffocating grief. "You said life goes on. You celebrated while I buried her." She opened her mouth to respond, but I kept going, louder now, no longer afraid to be cruel. "You called it a tragedy, like it was a line in someone else's book. You didn't come. You didn't send flowers. You didn't even ask what the service was like. And now you want me to feel sorry for you?" I laughed once, bitter and short. "There's no such thing as overkill when someone spits on your child's grave." Her face twisted, rage overtaking the faux sorrow. "You're a monster," she spat, her voice rising into something feral. "You think what you did makes you righteous? You think destroying your own family makes you strong?" Her hands were clenched now, her whole body shaking with fury, and for a moment she looked like she wanted to slap me. "You've always been jealous of me," she hissed. "You were just waiting for a reason." I stared at her, feeling nothing but cold resolve in my chest. I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I didn't try to defend myself. I just stood in the doorway of the home Lily would never grow up in and said flatly, "I didn't disagree." That stopped her. She blinked, mouth open like she'd expected a fight, and found only silence. I could see it then, the shift in her eyes when she realized there was nothing left in me to manipulate, nothing left in me to beg from, and no road back to the pedestal she'd built for herself out of lies and charm and carefully rehearsed vulnerability. She had spent her life convinced she was untouchable, adored no matter the damage she caused, but here, now, she was just a woman unraveling in the doorway of the sister she had betrayed beyond forgiveness. She screamed something else, I don't remember what. I didn't care. I closed the door before she could finish the sentence, the sound of it slamming shut more satisfying than anything I'd felt in months. I locked it without hesitation, turned away without looking back. Her voice faded quickly, swallowed by the city noise and the dying light. I didn't check the window. I didn't wonder how long she stayed. I just walked to Lily's room, sat on the floor beside her empty bed, and finally let the silence settle over me like a blanket. Not peace, not yet, but silence. And for now, that was enough. The sentencing came on a gray, heavy morning that matched the weight in my chest. I didn't attend in person. I didn't need to. I had read every line of the indictment, every filing, every cold, clinical paragraph detailing what Rebecca had done: wire fraud, conspiracy, falsification of healthcare records, violation of federal anti-kickback statutes. Her name had appeared in bold on official court documents that would follow her for the rest of her life, no longer framed by achievement or ambition, but by criminality. She was no longer top regional rep, she was inmate number 43758. The headlines were clear and merciless: former pharmaceutical executive sentenced to 5 years for healthcare fraud. She didn't cry in the courtroom, according to the coverage. She didn't speak. There was no grand apology, no public reckoning. Just a woman in a pantsuit hearing the number that would define the next 5 years of her life. My parents didn't take it as quietly. By then, they had sold nearly everything of value, liquidating retirement accounts, cashing out long-term investments, even putting the house on the market, the same one where we had celebrated Christmases, birthdays, the one with the rose bushes Lily had loved when she was little. My mother had told herself she would leave that garden to Lily one day, but in the end, she left it behind to pay the retainer fees for Rebecca's fourth attorney. The debts had piled up fast: legal bills, media consultants, private investigators they'd hired to try and prove some malicious smear campaign. It was absurd. Delusional. But they had poured everything into protecting her, even as she stopped answering their calls from jail. The calls to me started soon after. First from my mother, trembling voice, forced composure. She left voicemails like she was still pretending everything could be patched over with time. "Emily, honey, I know this has all been hard. We're not asking for forgiveness, just understanding." Then my father, gruff and awkward, clearly pushed into it. "We didn't know it would go this far. You made your point. Just enough, okay?" But I hadn't made a point. I had told the truth. And what they were experiencing wasn't punishment. It was consequence. They kept trying. Emails filled with faux warmth, desperate explanations, promises to make things right. But there was nothing left to fix. Not after they'd raised glasses over chlorine blue water while I stood alone at Lily's grave. Not after they'd chosen to protect a daughter who stole from the sick and dying over the granddaughter who had suffered quietly through every second of her short, beautiful life. Their loyalty was never in question, it had always belonged to Rebecca. They hadn't just overlooked the funeral. They had rewritten it out of their lives completely. The final call came on a Sunday. My mother's voice was brittle, exhausted, less performative now. They were being forced to sell the house. They were out of options. She said she was scared. Said they had nowhere to go. Then came the question, not even veiled. "Can you help us?" "Just a little. We're family." I stared at the phone for a long time before answering, knowing the conversation would be brief. When I picked up, her breath caught like she hadn't believed I would actually do it. She launched into her plea, about years of sacrifice, about how we didn't know what Rebecca was doing, how we made mistakes, but we're still your parents. I listened in silence. Then, when she paused, I said quietly, "You chose a house over a child. This is just the bill coming due." There was a pause, one long, hollow second where she didn't speak. Then a soft, stunned breath, and the line went dead. I blocked her number. Blocked my father's. Blocked the email addresses, the social media accounts, every digital tether they might try to use to pull me back into their version of reality. I severed the last thread without flinching. I wasn't interested in reconciliation. There are wounds that don't heal, not because they fester, but because they're too clean, cut by choices, by silence, by the absence of love when it mattered most. My home is quiet now. Lily's room remains exactly as she left it, and sometimes I sit in there when the nights get too long, when the world outside feels too loud. I don't feel vengeance anymore. I don't feel rage. What's left is something colder, steadier. A line drawn in permanent ink. I did what needed to be done. I told the truth. And when it cost them everything, they called it cruelty. But it was never cruelty. It was justice wearing the only face it had left. Years passed in the way time does when grief becomes a permanent fixture, quietly, relentlessly, without asking permission. Seasons changed, headlines faded, and the storm that had once consumed everything I knew eventually settled into silence. Rebecca served her sentence in full. There were no appeals, no reduced time for good behavior, no teary statements made in courtrooms. Just 5 years behind concrete walls, stripped of her title, her career, her meticulously crafted persona. I never visited. I never responded to the 2 letters she sent from inside, their words carefully written but bloated with the same kind of manipulation she'd always leaned on, thin apologies wrapped in self-pity, lines like "I lost everything and I hope one day you'll see that I'm more than my mistakes." I burned them without reading the last paragraphs. Whatever she wanted from me no longer existed. My parents withered in their absence from relevance. They lost the house. They moved to a rental in a town I'd never heard of, somewhere without a neighborhood association or manicured lawns, a place where no one recognized their last name or cared about their past. They sold family heirlooms, dipped into dwindling savings, and slowly disappeared from the orbit of anyone who once returned their calls. I never saw them again. Not once. They tried, early on, holidays, birthdays, anniversaries marked by unanswered emails or the occasional envelope that arrived in my mailbox with stiff handwriting and no return address, but I didn't open them. There was nothing in their words that could undo what they had chosen. Lily had been a living, breathing child, and they had treated her memory like a speed bump on their way to a party. That doesn't get rewritten. That doesn't get forgiven. For a long time I drifted. I kept to myself, worked part-time jobs that didn't require me to explain why I avoided small talk. I lived simply, quietly, and tried not to think too far ahead. The weight of those years never truly left my body, but at some point, I began to feel a restlessness that wasn't anger, but something deeper, an ache for meaning. I couldn't change what happened to Lily. I couldn't bring her back. But I knew, intimately, what it meant to be a parent trapped in a system that doesn't bend for grief or fear or exhaustion. I remembered what it felt like to sleep in hospital chairs, to argue with insurance reps while my child lay hooked up to tubes, to translate medical jargon with one hand while wiping tears with the other. I remembered the way silence felt in those hallways. So I went back to those halls, not as a nurse this time, but as a volunteer. I started showing up at the Pediatric Cancer Center 3 days a week, quietly at first, sitting with parents during consultations, helping them fill out forms, holding their hands when the doctors walked in with scans and timelines and terrible words. I learned how to guide without overwhelming, how to listen without fixing. I met mothers with eyes hollowed by sleepless nights, fathers who flinched at every phone call, siblings who whispered questions no one else could answer. I became someone who understood without explanation. And slowly, day by day, the sharp edges of my grief dulled, not because they faded, but because I found somewhere to place them. The work didn't heal me. That's not the right word. Healing implies a return to what was, and there was no going back. But it gave shape to something that had once been unbearable. Purpose grew where vengeance had once lived. I didn't tell people my story unless they asked. I didn't talk about Rebecca, or the trial, or the headlines that once followed my name like a shadow. That wasn't why I was there. I was there because I had lived the worst days imaginable and come out the other side still standing. And sometimes, just standing beside someone else is enough. There are still moments, quiet ones, usually, when I find myself sitting on the floor of Lily's room, fingers brushing the edges of her old storybooks, the ones I could still recite from memory. Her name is still written on the wall in soft pastel letters. Her drawings are still taped to the closet door. The room is frozen in time, and I don't try to change that. It's not a shrine. It's a truth. My daughter lived. She laughed. She fought harder than anyone I've ever known. And she was loved. And now, finally, after everything, I found something like peace. Not in the downfall of those who hurt her. Not in silence. Not in forgetting. But in the quiet, steady act of remembering her, and doing something good with what's left of me. The morning of the 3rd anniversary of Lily's death was quiet, the kind of stillness that settles over everything like a held breath. The cemetery was empty when I arrived, just the sound of wind brushing through trees and the occasional bird slicing through the silence. I parked in the same spot I always did, walked the familiar path between rows of stone markers, and knelt beside the small headstone with her name etched deep into the granite, the letters worn smooth at the edges from my fingers tracing them again and again over the years. I brought fresh flowers, peach-colored lilies, the ones she used to point at in the grocery store floral aisle and call hers, and placed them gently at the base of the marker. The grass was cool beneath my knees. The earth, soft. I sat there for a long time without speaking. Time no longer passed the same way in this place. Here, everything felt suspended in memory and what-ifs and the ache of an entire life that never had the chance to happen. I let my hand rest on the cold stone and closed my eyes, breathing in the damp air, the scent of the flowers, the faint trace of dirt. Her name sat in the center of everything I was, still. And then I whispered, quietly, more to the ground than to the air, they suffered, sweetheart. They paid for what they did. But I'm done now. The words didn't come from triumph. They came from something deeper, something quieter, something I hadn't known how to name until recently. It wasn't peace, exactly, and it wasn't forgiveness, but it was an ending. Not for her, never for her, but for the part of me that had once needed fire to stay upright. That part had carried me through the worst nights of my life, through the betrayal, through the silence, through the rage that became routine. It had driven me to uncover the truth, to hold people accountable, to strip away the lies and make them face what they had done. And it had worked. They had fallen. Rebecca, stripped of everything she built on cruelty. My parents, left hollow and alone, their legacy scorched by their own choices. There was nothing left for them to hide behind. Nothing left for me to burn. But somewhere in the slow crawl of days after that, I had realized that revenge wasn't the end of the story. It didn't stitch me back together. It didn't bring her back. It just kept me alive long enough to survive the emptiness, to outlast the pain, to make it through to something beyond survival. It was a bridge. It gave shape to my rage so I wouldn't drown in it. And once I crossed it, I didn't need it anymore. I opened my eyes and looked at her name again, then up toward the clouds drifting slowly across the sky. My voice didn't shake when I said it. I didn't feel hollow when I let the words go. I didn't forgive them. But I let go. It didn't feel like a release. It felt like laying something down after carrying it too far, too long. Not because it wasn't mine to carry, but because I had carried it far enough. I would never forget what they did. I would never invite them back into my life. But I wouldn't carry the weight of their damage anymore. That didn't belong to me. I stayed beside her grave until the light shifted and the wind picked up again, tugging gently at the hem of my jacket like a reminder to return to the world, to the quiet life I had built, the work I did, the families I helped, the version of myself I had become, not in spite of her death, but because I refused to let it be the end of everything. I ran my fingers once more over the soft curve of her name, stood up slowly, and left the flowers in the grass, the petals already catching the breeze. As I walked back to the car, I didn't feel lighter. I just felt still. Solid. Like whatever had been unraveling inside me had finally gone quiet. And that was enough.